my dissertation advisor. So we've been through the wars, and back again. But we've just known each other for a really long time, and I owe him so much. I mean, obviously, as your dissertation advisor, helped me get my first job, but even more than those things, it was his class on Reformed theology that really turned me from Baptist to Presbyterian. It's all his fault. And today's sermon, which felt kind of, it was such a serious topic for me, it was hard to bring any energy. That was just weighing on me, but running through it all was this note of grace, and that's straight from the playbook, the Ottati playbook. So, without any further ado, Doug Ottati.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. There are a lot of theologians in the world. Some of them like to get turned loose in churches, and I like that. So I think it's a good thing. And it's great to be here with Dave. He said it, we've known each other for a long, long time. And he's, of course, it's been a real pleasure, and it still is a pleasure to know him. And he lives right nearby where we are now, so who knew? As far as converting him to Presbyterianism goes from being a Baptist, I guess it has to happen to somebody. I don't know that it happens that often, but there you are. What I wanted to do with you is have 3 sessions and talk about war and Christian ethics. And the first session, I want to talk about some themes and passages in the Bible that connect with questions of war. And in the second session, I'm going to talk about some basic stances or positions that have been taken in the history of the church on questions of war. And then in the third one, I thought, well, we could just talk about some contemporary questions. We really didn't plan it this way, to have this session here while there is a war going on, although I should say I've been teaching this stuff for a really long time, decades and decades, and I've never been more than 3 years away from a hot engagement that the United States has been involved in one way or another, so I'm not that surprised when it comes up. So for today, we want to just talk over war and Christian ethics, biblical pictures, themes, and a kind of a question that comes up. What to do is first is just talk about different passages and themes. I'm going to start with some that you may not have thought of so frequently with respect to these things, but here we go. And they're from the book of Joshua. Now, the book of Joshua has to do with the Israelites going to the land of Canaan, which has been promised to them, right? But it turns out that the land of Canaan is occupied and that there are people there. And so the book of Joshua starts off with a series of military engagements to take the land to be occupied in Canaan. This is still a contemporary theme, but we're not going to go into most of the contemporary things. We want to talk about some of this ancient material here. So basically, the Israelites enter the promised land, but it's already occupied by different groups and city-states or kingdoms. So the way things go early on here is that nations are really city-states. They have the collections or communities, and then they have agricultural lands around them. Is the way that all starts. So these different cities that are talked about are city-states, and they have kings. They're not terribly large by any contemporary standards, but that's how things are organized. And they are organized that way in part because of the single most important invention, technological invention of the ancient world is agriculture. It's not rockets or anything. It's agriculture, which means that people can eat. And it means that when you have an agricultural community, you don't wander. You have a particular place, a sedentary city, and then you have lands around it. And that's the way things are organized here when they go into Canaan. So Joshua, son of Nun, commands the Israelites as they cross the river Jordan and take cities and kingdoms in the land by force. And that is the sort of basic thing that's going on here in the book of Joshua. And I just want to start by reading a few verses from Joshua chapter 6. Starting with the first verse. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all of the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead. So those are the directions, the way this is written, from the Lord to Joshua. And then we're going to have the engagement a little bit, starting in verse 15 to 21. Maybe a lot of you had the story of Jericho when you were a kid in Sunday school. I did, and at a certain point you walk around 7 times and the walls come down. It's kind of fun when you're a kid, but it has an ending that they don't usually read when you're in Sunday school as a child. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. Well, those are the directions. But the Bible gets repetitive sometimes, right? And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and she helped scout out the area, and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers that we sent. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel the object of destruction, bringing trouble upon it." So you're not allowed to take booty, right? You can't take it and just take it home with you. That's bad. "But all the silver and golden vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. And this is the verse that doesn't really get read when you're a kid. "Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys." And that ends it. This is a sort of portrait of a total war, where the idea is you go in there, and as it says in other places in Joshua, leave nothing that breathes. So no people, no livestock, no nothing. It's pretty dramatic, it's pretty direct, and it's pretty vivid. And you have a number of engagements like this in the book of Joshua. The people of Ai in chapter 8 are all devoted to the sword. Every person in Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir, these are all destroyed by the Israelites in succession in a number of chapters in the book of Joshua. The texts themselves, in all probability, it's hard to historically reconstruct stuff like this, but the texts themselves, in all probability, are simply idealized, right? You're not really taking a city by going around it 7 times and jumping up and down, but okay, you have a ritual that goes along with it, and there you are. They're idealized, and the idea here is that God is sovereign and fights for Israel. So you have some people interpret this saying it really doesn't have to do with the conduct of war, because God fights for them, and it's an idealized picture. And that's a fair enough thing to say, except that then I think you could ask, well, just what is being idealized anyway? And what does the idealization suggest about war and the conduct of war? And what it suggests is that the ideal war, at least just here in Joshua, is one where God fights for you, and there is the total destruction of your enemy, and that's what victory is. I don't know what else to say there. We were just reading this stuff. You can see it. I could try and dance around and give you some other happy interpretation of this, but it seems to me that would just be a dance, and I'm not going to try it. Later, political and military organizations will move toward the notion of war as a conflict among combatants. That is, soldiers and combatants, and only, see. That's a later development, and you can see it take place in the Bible. Of course, it doesn't only take place in the Bible, But you know, everyone here knows the stories of Saul and David, right? I mean, Saul gets the worst press in the Hebrew Scriptures. He really, it's not his fault, I don't think. So what happens is Israel is being run by a bunch of judges. Huh? So every judge has their own separate clan. And when you get together, the judges decide cases. And when there's a problem, the judges whip everyone together, and you get them together, and they're supposed to go fight a war. Okay, so it's a way of going about things. But it turns out that the Philistines don't do that anymore. The Philistines have a standing army and a king. The standing army is equipped, and it's trained, and it's got commanders. And the Israelites are having the tar beat out of them all the time by the Philistines because they can't match it. So the Israelites decide they want a king. This gets very mixed reviews in the Hebrew Scriptures, having a king, in part because the judges don't want a king. And the judges don't want a king because they're running the show. They don't want to have some king show up, huh? And then not only that, then the king has to levy taxes and has to maintain an army. And the judges are only too happy to tell you every bad thing that's going to happen when you have a king. On the other hand, if you don't want to be overrun by the Philistines, you need one. Okay, so that's the development. So what happens, Saul becomes the first king, but he's a transition figure. And you can tell because in the passages, in some of them, he's taller and more handsome than anyone else. That's the positive review of the kingship, right? In others of them, he's cowering beneath a bushel. That's the negative review of the kingship. So then what happens? All the judges get the people together. Philistines are coming in the battle. They're getting ready to go in. And Saul has to wait for Samuel to show up and do a sacrifice. And Samuel is not showing up. He's dragging his feet. And of course, what happens? You get your army together. You wait too long, it starts going home. This is not a good thing if you have to go up against the Philistines with their army and a king. So Saul decides, okay, I'm going to do it. As soon as he performs the sacrifice, out behind a bush, boom, jumps Samuel and says, because you did this, you're going to die on Mount Gilboa, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay, thanks a bunch, right? And so then he goes in there and he gets killed. And then eventually David comes down from the north. But David has his own band of merry men. He doesn't depend on the judges. And when he shows up, he brings his own army. And he becomes the first great king of Israel. Anyway, there's that transition. But when you get to that point, you begin to get a different picture of war as combat between combatants, between armies, where you're not supposed to directly target and kill civilians, right? But that's still in the future when you're talking about the Joshua stuff. Okay, so we have these portraits in Joshua. And what you have in Joshua is a kind of picture of a total and holy war. God fights for you, God's on your side. Victory means complete destruction. Now, some Christians have appealed to some of the motifs here in Christian history, and we'll talk about that a little bit next time. Some, not all, some statements about wars against Native Americans and some statements about conquest in South Africa refer to these passages in order to authorize complete destruction. So these passages are, I'll put this, in the history of things, they're kind of outliers, but they're not so far outlined that people don't appeal to them once in a while, through crusades and some other things, and we'll see that as we proceed. So that's one kind of an image here. Now let's go to a very, very different image, because we're going to have a very different one here. David, as I said, is the first successful king of Israel, and he is a warrior, and he's a successful warrior. He has his problems, but he's a successful warrior. He is God's anointed one, chosen to be king of Israel and to lead the whole shebang here. And some texts in the Hebrew Scriptures portray God's steadfast love forever for David and his descendants, particularly in 2 Samuel, where it's going to say that with David's kingship, there are going to be his relatives on the throne forever. It's never going away. And they're going to get in trouble. And when they get in trouble and they have problems, God is going to discipline them the way a father disciplines a child. But he's not going to kill him, not going to get rid of him. And they're going to stay on the throne forever. And so the Davidic monarchy is for all time. There you go. Now it turns out that this is a problematic prophecy because it's going to turn out that later Israel's going to get carried into exile by Babylon. The kingship is going to run into trouble. But when you get to the New Testament, Jesus is supposed to be on the throne of David. So Jesus is presented as the fulfillment of the monarchy, the fulfillment of the kingship, but it's going to be a kind of odd fulfillment is what we're going to see. So we have the notion of a kingship, we have it with David, and in the Gospel of Luke, the claim is made by the angel Gabriel speaking to Mary that her son, quote, will be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign forever. Forever is a long time. So now we have a kingship that's going to be without end. And Jesus is going to be the focal point. So he is a king. And kingship is related to the conduct of war early on. That's how it starts out with David and those things. But it's going to end up being that Jesus is a kind of an alternative and odd king. Right? For one thing, Jesus is a king who's going to be crucified. And he's a crucified king for whom his followers rightly will not fight, as it says in John 18, which is, Pilate interviews Jesus and says, look, what's up here? And he says, well, my followers are followers of truth. And Pilate says, well, what is truth, He said, well, they're not going to fight. Pilate says, okay, I don't need to talk about that anymore. We're off to the races. You don't have anyone who's going to fight. Pilate's not interested in you. It's a really interesting passage there. But what is truth? Is not meant like Pilate wants to become a scientist and investigate the truth. What it's meant is it's insignificant, you see, if you're not going to fight. So here we have Jesus, an alternative king, crucified. His followers rightly will not fight. And this is pretty odd. You can contrast it with what you see in the book of Joshua. You can contrast it, if you want, with David and his merry men, because this is an accomplished warrior here. You can contrast it with all those sorts of things. And we're going to get, as you would expect, a different kind of a portrait now, a different kind of a picture. In addition, Jesus' teachings have a strong pacifist bent. This is no one's secret. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Matthew 5:19. You will notice that peacemakers in regular world history are not often that blessed, right? You just call up Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat if you have a Ouija board and ask them how it went, because they were assassinated by their own people for making peace. So this, blessed are the peacemakers somewhere, but okay. And you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. You're reading through the Sermon on the Mount. If you're like me, you're feeling pretty good when you hear the first lines. You're not supposed to murder anybody. I'm thinking, pretty good. The best I can tell, I never murdered anybody. If I did it in my sleep. I can't be responsible. I don't understand it. I don't remember it. And then we go, but now you're never supposed to be angry. Well, that's getting a little tougher for the Italian kid from New Jersey. That may not work out too happily. But then we go further. Well, you're supposed to love your neighbor and even your enemies. And I don't want to tell you, now I'm out at the plate. It's not even close. The catcher has the ball. I haven't even coming around third base yet. I'm dead. I'm out. You read the Sermon on the Mount, some tough little sayings morally there to say that everyone passes. I'm sure I don't pass them. Jimmy Carter, incidentally, was also sure he didn't pass them when he was interviewed a long time ago, because they would ask him, sort of smarty pants press in New York, asked him, did he ever violate any of the commandments? He said, oh, yeah, sure. And because they think they got him. They think they got the Baptist Sunday school teacher from Georgia, and now they're going to point out that he's a hypocrite. And they say, well, which one did you not? He said, well, you're never supposed to look at a woman with lust in your heart. And they go, oh, gotcha. Well, sure. What are we talking about here? How many two-eyed men do you see in the world? And how many of them really pass muster on that score? And Carter knew that. He's a Sunday school teacher. He knows that. Okay. So tough stuff in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Don't even be angry with anybody. Do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Not exactly sounding like, the World Wrestling Federation or anything like that. I mean, just, look, here it is. And you can see the contrast with what you got in Joshua there and so forth all the way through. Love your enemies. Well, it comes up in the Sermon on the Mount and also in Luke 6, different, related but different reasons given both times, essentially because God is perfect and is benevolent to everyone, and you should act like God. Right? Right, okay. Now, you have those sorts of sayings. What a number of Christian groups have taken these things to mean is that if you're a truly Christian community, you don't go to war. You do not employ violent means at all. This is strict confessional Christian pacifism. And you will see it for Amish, sometimes Mennonites, and then also Hutterites, mostly in Canada now, because they refused to fight in the First World War and had to go to Canada. So this is what we could call strict confessional Christian pacifism. You are a radical disciple of Jesus. And it doesn't mean you're just going to be in a lockup at high school one night and not go get a drink. I mean, I understand that's something, but if you think that's a complete discipleship of Jesus, that's a pretty low bar. What you got here, discipleship of Jesus, is turn the other cheek. Don't ever be angry with anyone. Love your enemies. This is pretty tough stuff. So you have some of these communities that claim if you're going to follow Jesus, that's what you do. And you don't do it because you're sure history is going to turn out okay if you do it. The way history turns out is God's business, not yours. You're supposed to be faithful, you just don't do it. Huh? It's a great, great tradition. It is, you will see, a minority report in Christian tradition. How many people are really going to act like that a lot of the time? But it's pretty impressive. Huh? I mean, you probably saw some years ago a terrible thing, a shooting at an Amish school. And then they had a service and they invited the parents of the shooter to a worship service, a memorial service, and a reception with them. And they kept the press way far away. They had to use telescopic lenses even to get anything of it all because they weren't interested in the press being there. And they told the parents that they forgave their son and they forgave them. And that's it. This is strict confessional pacifism. They didn't decide to get a posse together and go out and get somebody or something. Not a cowboy film, right? Okay. It's Amish. All right. So there you have two basic contrasting images that you can identify in the Bible. One is a kind of total war, and the other over here appears to be, at least by some interpretations, no war at all. Okay? And so you've got things there. Okay. Most of Christian tradition has not taken up either of those two things. For strict radical Christian discipleship out of some of those Protestant traditions, you can ask, and Peter Riedemann does, can you be a ruler and a Christian? Well, yeah, but not for long. You got to choose what you want to be, is what they're going to say. You can't manufacture swords. They're not up to guns yet. You can't manufacture swords. You can't make military uniforms. There's a bunch of things you can't use courts of law because they wield constraining power. And you can't participate in a lot of civil governments because they wield constraining power. And you and I can tell because, like on April 15th, the government's not going to call you up and ask you if you feel like paying your taxes. You got to pay your taxes. There are laws. It's a constraint, right? Okay. They won't go to courts of law and so forth. Can you be a Christian and a lawyer? No. and can you be a Christian and a judge? Not even close, as far as those communities are concerned. Now you know why you will meet very few Mennonite lawyers, but you're going to meet a lot of Presbyterian lawyers. Because Presbyterians see this differently and think you should participate in these things. Because they see the courts as a strategy of restraint and helping people to move toward justice and so forth. There are different ways of looking at courts here. Okay, most Christian tradition is made up of neither of proponents of holy war nor of strict pacifist discipleship. In general, most of Christian tradition has a strong preference for nonviolence, particularly with domestic and internal things. But it leaves open the possibility of justified participation in war. That's most of Christian tradition. Strong preference for nonviolence. Do things nonviolently if you can, and there's a major value there. But there can be participation in war and military service and so forth. That's most of it. Now, to set that up, let me just say a couple of things. I mean, one is there are other images in the Bible besides this, though not too many of them are that developed. But you can see the Bible has got some sort of contrasting things here. And then you might ask about Jesus' values and how you're planning on living with those values in a world. Not everyone thinks that follow Jesus simply means you have to be a pacifist. And there are reasons for that, because Jesus, for instance, talks to Roman soldiers and doesn't tell them, hey, it's time to desert, buddy, or anything like that. It says that you take your wages and you should, et cetera. It doesn't look like he's trying to get everyone to leave the military. This is a point that a number of theologians pointed out through the ages. So you've got with Jesus kind of strict teachings about love the enemy, look kind of pacifist, but you also got this other stuff here. Okay. How does this work? Well, it works a little bit with the story of the Good Samaritan. I bet you everyone here knows the story of Good Samaritan. That's a headliner, right? And the Gospel of Luke has two so-called parables or stories that are not duplicated anywhere else in the New Testament. One of them is the prodigal son, and one of them is the Good Samaritan. Not a bad time out, huh? I mean, if you want to have two stories that are exclusively yours, not a bad choice. Everyone remembers those. Okay, so Good Samaritan, just to review. This guy going down the road, Jerusalem road, and he gets beat up. He gets beat up. You need to know when you're going down these roads, this is dangerous. You're walking and things turn and you can't see everything. You travel, and you walk around the wrong corner and poof, there you go. You don't want to be walking along on the road traveling in those days. And so he gets beat up within an inch of his life or something. And then, a priest comes by, doesn't help him. Pharisee comes by, doesn't help him. Two people who are high up in a kind of Jewish religious hierarchy don't help him. Jesus himself is a Jew. He's telling this story to a Jewish lawyer. So Jesus is saying, look, our own hierarchy, we're not doing this. And then comes a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans, the Jews think that Samaritans are religiously deficient and kind of full of it. And the Samaritans think the Jews are religiously deficient and kind of full of it. And they are fighting little skirmishes, and they don't like each other. So Samaritan's supposed to be a religious dummy, get it wrong. Jesus talking to a Jewish lawyer, knows the law. Right? And he says, well, what do I have to do to be saved? And what do I do? And he says, well, you follow the law. And then, who is my neighbor? And then he tells him the story. And then at the end says, all right, you want to do the right thing? Do what the Samaritan does. You want to act the way God wants you to act, the way God acts? Act like a Samaritan. You've got to understand this is a complete travesty as far as the Jewish lawyer is concerned. You mean a Samaritan is the model? That can't be. They don't know what they're doing. Nice story, a lot of things to say, at a whole bunch of levels about it, and we could talk about many, many levels about it. Very important story, including the wisdom of the Samaritan and the way he takes care of him, taking him to a place and giving the money and coming back to check to make sure that the innkeeper really did it, and stuff like that. And the Samaritan's no dummy. But what I would like to point out here is that it's an interesting story because later Christian tradition is going to ask a question that could be related to a twist in the story if you wanted to. So the Samaritan shows up, and the guy's already beat up, and the people who've beaten him up are gone. And the loving thing to do, boing, yoing, 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 is to help him. All right, hey, we got that. And he does a great job. But what happens if we have a story called the early Samaritan? He gets there while these guys are beating on him. Within an inch of his life, maybe going to kill him. What's the loving thing to do then? A nice little question. And it's the kind of question that some later Christian theologians are going to ask, and they're going to wonder about it. So St. Augustine, in the 5th century, who lives through the fall of Rome, which is a slightly big event, right? I mean, the biggest empire in the world collapses, and a bunch of barbarians from the north show up and take away all good Italian food. That's a joke. I'm an Italian kid from New Jersey. I think the food is better. He said, Augustine argues that defending the innocent from harm is a legitimate military calling. It's a way to try and protect the innocent part of the time, see? And he writes to a commander named Boniface, who is defending against the barbarians. Boniface wants to go become a monk. He's older, his wife has died, he's about had it now. And Augustine writes back and says, no, you got a calling. You're supposed to do that because there is such a thing as a legitimate military calling to defend those who are under attack. See? And so you end up with this picture of war where you can ask under which circumstances it is permissible to go to war, and then how do you conduct war? Now, what's going to end up happening in this tradition is the circumstances are going to be to defend the innocent or to defend against imminent threats is what's going to happen in that tradition. And the conduct of war, there are going to be a number of things said, but you're not supposed to directly target non-combatants or civilians in hospitals and stuff, right? Okay? And that's going to end up being the predominant position in the history of Christianity, and it's going to end up being the background for what's now called international law that you will hear people talk about on very many different occasions, and you'll see some of the same terms come up. Non-combatant immunity will come up. Imminent threat will come up. And when you hear some contemporary politicians talk about wars, not all of them, but particularly in some of the Western democratic states, you will hear some of those same terms come up. You don't have to decide they're always being used legitimately, but the same terms will come up because they have to do with the morality of law, of war, and the way to go about it. And so you will see that the George W. Bush administration talked about some of Saddam Hussein's, quote, weapons of mass destruction as an imminent threat. Now, there's a big discussion as to whether those things even existed, and they weren't found. But you see the term imminent threat shows up. It's buzzwords, right? And then when you hear things in the press about different people being upset that certain civilian targets have been hit, it's because it violates non-combatant immunity or war as conflict between combatants. There is no such thing as an immaculate war. We'll talk about that. You can't run a war and not have all kinds of damage in different ways. And people die, and not always the people that ought to be targeted die. On the other hand, you're not supposed to directly target those things. Okay, so that's what we'll talk about in the next couple of sessions. What I just want you to see now is there are some different images in the Bible, and they can be understood in some of these ways. Right? I will try to answer any questions if I can. My wife, who is here, used to say that I go upstairs and make things up. And that was true, and that's when my study was on the 2nd floor. She can't say it anymore because it's on the 1st floor, but I probably still make them up. So.
Yeah, questions, comments?
So did I hear you correctly saying that for a war, we should not be the aggressor, we should be the defender?
So the way this tradition starts is that you're supposed to be defending against some kind of a threat or an incursion. Now, that doesn't mean that the incursion has actually taken place. And so there's this big discussion over the meaning of the term imminent threat, a threat that's about to take place. If you think about it in medieval terms, it's a bunch of knights at your border sharpening their swords. But if you think about it in other terms, it can have to do with other sorts of things, right? So in more recent warfare and so forth, you have air war is a very big deal, and that can be quick. And even quicker can be missiles and things of that sort. So what constitutes an imminent threat is itself a point of discussion. But I think you will see very often when we're involved in a war, that's one of the points of discussion. But yes, essentially, they're supposed to be, in that sense, defensive. In that sense, defensive. How are we doing? The tradition has a number of different things to say. And once we go through it, there's not going to be just one detailed Christian position here. But I think you'll see that they have, other than the Holy War one, they have a community of interest, which is you're not supposed to initiate violent activity, and it's supposed to be conducted, they will say, with, quote, humanity and restraint. Now then one of the questions is, what does that mean, right? And it gets a little dicey. Yeah?
Doug, the final sentence on the first page, I think it's kind of enough. You know, like the biblical images are very strong, right? Coming out, total war,
Right.
Nothing survives, or no war.
Right.
And then somehow the tradition comes up with a third option.
Right.
And it's this kind of mixed, strong preference for nonviolence.
Right.
With the possibility.
Yeah.
Not
It is mixed, and one of the reasons they mix it is because of an evolving understanding of what civil government does and what its responsibilities are. And the idea then is that a civil government is supposed to maintain a kind of legitimate commerce amongst persons and interactions within a society, and it's also supposed to defend the society against threats, and there are multiple civil governments, right? So what happens then is that participation in civil government is supposed to be a good thing. It's a good thing to have courts, at least someone like John Calvin's going to claim that. It's a good thing to participate in a legitimate police force. He's going to claim that. Now he's going to ask, well, a police force and an armed force, how are they related? How are they different? There are some differences, but in both cases, he's going to think they try and restrain violence in order to protect the innocent. This is going to be a kind of theme that goes all the way through. And it's one that starts up with Augustine. So this question of what to do in circumstances becomes real, and it becomes a question of what to do as governments.
Great. I think that brings us to 12 o'clock.
All right.
Will you join me in thanking Dr.
Oh,
Ottati?
thanks for having me. Thanks.
And next week, Doug, who will be talking about?
Next week, we're going to go through Holy War and